All right. Thanks everybody for coming. The title of this talk, it's going to be nice and short. You work with computers. We fix my printer. So if you don't know me, I'm Alec Harrison. I'm a software consultant at Lean Techniques. Do a bunch of other stuff on the side as well as AI workshops. We have some workshops also on GitHub to run through. If you want to run through those that kind of prioritize learning over cost, where sometimes some of the Microsoft workshops require you to spend some money. We try to do it as free as possible or being as overly transparent as possible when showing what your bill is. So if you're trying to learn Azure, for example, nothing comes up as a surprise. Also working on a podcast. We're hoping to get out weekly podcasts. We're hoping to start this Friday. So that's what the QR code links to. And if you have questions, comments, concerns about this, feel free to reach out. So I think a lot of us in the IT space have probably dealt with just helping people with their general IT problems. If you read the manual, which, let's be honest, most of us don't, you get something like this for what I thought was a simple printer, but I am still scrolling. And took somebody tons of time and effort, I'm sure, to write this. And we don't really deal with that. The other thing is if you have bilingual family members like I do, it can be difficult to explain to them. You can't even throw the manual at them and be like, here, go figure it out, because you may only have the English one. Well, the kind of impetus of this was I wanted to play with chatbots. I wanted to have kind of a more realistic example. So I'll walk you through on how we can take this single English document, which is 220 lines long, convert it through a logic app. So writing, it looks hairy. It's not super hairy, but writing very little code to make it so that we can support any question in any language and answer people's questions as they come up. So we'll first roll into kind of the impetus of this. We're using what's called the RAG pattern, or retrieval augmented generation. What that is basically you give ChatGPT the ability to phone a friend and say like, hey, I'm going to ask you a question. Look at this specific context I care about more than the open model that's out there. So you can have it have some proprietary data, in our case, the printer data that it may not be trained on. And we're going to go ahead and add an index. So, sorry, not add an index. We're going to import our data. So this is Azure Cognitive Search. You can actually get away with doing this on all free tier minus the OpenAI spec. They charge you, I think it's a penny per 1,000 tokens, which we'll talk through here. There's a rough translation, but it cost me probably a couple pennies to run this demo. So we can actually connect it to an Azure Blob Storage, which is going to house the resource. I've already gone through and indexed this. You can have it run as much as you want. So if you have a big company document store, you can go ahead and just keep re-indexing it. Anything that Azure Cognitive Search supports. So it supports SharePoint, Blob Storage, a lot of your online profiles or data stores. So once that's indexed, if you've used ChatGPT before or Azure OpenAI before, there's a new feature called adding your data source. One bummer of this, which the UI kind of doesn't work, so you can probably get away from it for now, is if you try to link a Azure search that's a free tier, it'll actually give you an exception saying that's not allowed. You can totally still just click the next button and it works. But one downside is once you refresh this page, your data store actually goes away. So you have to go through and keep reconfiguring it other times. If you're not a technical person or if you don't necessarily have access to this page, you got a lot of those pain points. So what we're going to do is we're going to end up creating a REST endpoint here that will allow us to do that all through Logic Apps. So I am not a Logic App wizard at all, so this is going to look kind of gross. I apologize in advance. I should have wrote code or asked GPT to do this, but in my effort to host this as cheap as possible and do as little coding as possible, that's kind of the impetus of this. So we're going to have if you're not familiar with Logic Apps, it's essentially just a triggered thing that you can then use built-in plugins to plug and play and get code out there, so you don't have to write a lot of your code. You don't have to really worry about hosting. It's all kind of there. And it actually gives you a URL to hit to. In this specific example, what we're going to do is I'm going to ask the bot. I can find my Postman. How do I change the language on the screen of my printer? And I'm going to ask it in Spanish. We've only trained this model with RAG in English. So what we're first going to do, if we follow through here, we have some placeholder variables. That's just to cut down on the looping and have less logic. We're first going to call Azure Translate. So what that's going to do is it's going to first take our request that's coming in the body of the message above, and then we're going to translate it if you look to English. One cool thing about this is you can actually tell it what language to put it to. If you want to save some time and some compute, you can actually say what language it's coming from. But in order to make it kind of a universal translator, you can put just what it's going to. So in this case, we'll be giving it Spanish. In the grand scheme of things, the API doesn't care. It'll actually output us what it thinks the language is as well. We're going to then parse that JSON. And then because the API allows you to send multiple prompts at a time, there's going to be some for looping. Really, we're for eaching all these, and it's a bunch of arrays of just a single element. That's all we're after in this particular case. Then what that's going to do is actually use our OpenAI service, and it's going to go ahead and call with our, so we have our OpenAI service that's then going to call with the parameters of Azure Cognitive Search. So this is the RAG piece that's filing into there, that you can then call that endpoint with those parameters. We're going to pass it to the content. So this is the question we're asking. So current item is what the current translation we got back was in this case. I also added the text to fully describe the answer. Don't reference the document because it liked to reference different points where there's images. This kind of works most of the time, but sometimes it still tries to point you back to saying, if you look at the document here or look at this image, it tries to refer back to the manual, which can be confusing if you're eventually going to look at it in a different language. So adding that prompt to kind of baseline it and let it know, I want you to use the language, don't refer back to your document. Then we're going to go through and do some more parsing, do some more for eaches so we can get in here. And what this is going to return is actually the choices. So when you call Azure OpenAI via the API, you have a choices array because you can actually return more than one answer if you want. In this particular case, we're answering one question with one answer. So that's what the reason is for all those for loops again. If you do this in a programming language, it looks a lot easier and a lot cleaner. This was more me being bullheaded and saying I didn't want to write an app service and have to host anything. And we'll go ahead and parse that result we got back. We are going to then ask it to convert it back to Spanish. So we got the answer back from OpenAI. We're now going to take that, convert it back to Spanish so that the end user in this case knows what we're talking about. We'll convert it back here, and then we'll return that variable. So when we hit the play button, it's a little anticlimactic because it's sitting there. And it does take about 10 seconds. When you give it the from, the to and from, it actually speeds up the process of translation. And then we'll see, this is what the translate kicked out. So it's telling us it detected English for the last one. It's confident 100% that this was English, and it kicked it back out in Spanish. And I don't speak Spanish, but if we go to, just for ease of this. So to change the language of the printer, we need to go to changing the LCD language section in product basics chapter. The guide will provide step-by-step. And this is where the deterministic part of the previous talk can come into play, because sometimes it will actually kick out the full steps 1 through whatever. Sometimes it refers back to other sections. So in the previous example, it has actually kicked out the full steps 1 through whatever, so you can actually go through and do it in that language. Again, with the model being not deterministic, just kind of depends on how you prompt it, how it's feeling at that current state time. With that, you should be able to create a model to answer any questions or any sort of manuals or data stores you or your company or your grandparents are trying to change their printers. Any questions? To make it? The concept, so that was my second time creating it, and it took me about 2 hours, and that's just because when the idea itself wasn't hard, it's the debugging in Logic Apps isn't great. So when you're just trying to parse data around, that's why, if you noticed right here, this is kind of where I threw in the towel. I would have ultimately liked to just dump out the answer, but just parsing through data is what all those for loops were all different troubleshooting, setting a variable, going back, seeing why I didn't run. And it kind of looks like this. If I go, let me see if I can find the run history. This is where I don't know what I'm doing with Logic Apps. I get lost in Logic Apps quite often. So if we go to the run history, oh, right there. So if you look, there was a lot of debugging of just, if you go into here, let's just go, for example, this one. Once, and especially if you start getting into these nested for eaches, you start clicking a for each, clicking a for each, clicking a for each. And this is where I was like really regretting that I didn't decide to just do it in a language. Because if you do normal JSON parsing, it's really easy. You don't have to do all these for eaches. You can just say grab the first one or only grab one. I'm only expecting one. But yeah, the debugging was probably the hardest part. Writing the actual logic itself wasn't terrible. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Yeah. So Azure Cognitive Search out of the box, I think you can point it at, let me look. I believe you can point it at SQL. Yeah, so Azure SQL, SQL Server on VMs, Cosmos, Blob, Data Store, Table Store, SharePoint. These are all the different sources that you can support, put it at. And the nice part is if you're not an expert on building indexes, like I'm totally not, you can just put in your data source and it'll try to auto predict what kind of index it should build for you. And I found it does like 80, 90% of what you need it to do. If you're an expert, you can probably fine tune it to be quicker. But when I'm just creating a POC app, I don't have to think about it. I just hit go, index my data, and it's there, ready to be queried. Yeah. Yeah, because it's to do the actual, because Azure OpenAI does have an HTTP interface. I thought about being super meta and just trying to build a chatbot that would use ChatGPT to translate it, then call out, then come back. But it just seemed like a lot of, I don't know, it seemed way too much ChatGPT, Azure OpenAI. And we already had a chat one. So I was trying to avoid that a little bit. And then also I hadn't used Azure Translate before the first time I built this. So I was kind of curious on just how that service worked. But yes. It used to be a standalone service, but now it's under the Azure Cognitive Services. I think it's they changed the name. Yeah. So it's under the language, and then there's a translator API for it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they've moved it. It used to be a standalone service, but they've kind of, I don't know, they're kind of bundling everything with the Azure AI Studio. So I think it's getting pushed under that umbrella of AI. Yeah, this is just the Azure OpenAI chat playground. So if you get access to Azure OpenAI, this is what you have to look at. You have the chat and the completions. Yeah. Yeah, it's similar. This is just the one that's built by Azure. The workshop was slightly different. It had a proxy in the middle so that they could time out people. So if you can log into my Azure account, you could use this and there's no restrictions. That one was slightly different, that they had a key so they could time people out so that people weren't using it to build whatever. But this URL is actually behind Azure Entra now. So you'd have to sign in with an account that has access to my Azure tenant to get into here. Yeah, so if you yeah, so if you close, I just refreshed it. I think it's when you leave it and come back, but the data sources do go away. It's not, I don't know what the timeout is that it invalidates them, but it's not forever. So you'd have to go back and keep re-adding them and doing all that. Yeah, you could do that, and then you wouldn't need to build a logic app, and you could have it go and anchor on your data and do all that with RAG, and it could do the translation piece as well. Yeah, so this is the Azure, this is part of the Azure OpenAI API. When you get a new Azure OpenAI instance, it spins up an API for you. And this right here is the actual API I have hosted for it. So what you would do is you just wouldn't pass you could pass the data source, it'd be the same. You could just have it, you'd have to give it another message. So you can give an array of messages. You can give what's called a system message to tell it, like, first you're going to translate from whatever language to English, then you can ask my thing, then do the final translation back. You could do something like that in here and get rid of a lot of the for loops and logic apps. You would just use more tokens and more compute, but I don't know what the cost difference is between using a cognitive service like Translate versus OpenAI. It might be slightly cheaper to translate it first, then throw it at OpenAI. That would be something I'd keep an eye out for, because it might be cheaper to use that purpose-built service than it is to use OpenAI or Azure OpenAI to do all that. Yeah. Cool. If there's any other questions, you guys can reach out to me. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. Email me or any other way. I was originally from Iowa. I've lived here for about a year. So that's how I got involved in the Iowa user groups and all that.